Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the late-night storytelling channel of the Destroyer of Souls. Today, as usual, I will continue to bring you real ghost stories sent in by uncles, aunts, brothers, sisters, friends, and younger siblings from all over. Today's video will be a very long story. Looking at the file that your editor sent me, there are nearly 40 pages, while normally it's only about 25 pages. I must say that the 3 stories today are extremely interesting. These are stories sent to me by one of our viewers. Before we dive into the main content, don't forget to like, share, and most importantly, be sure to click the bell icon next to it so you won't miss the latest videos, and feel free to leave your comments below. If any of you have true spiritual stories from your life, family, acquaintances, or friends, don't hesitate to email me at njofeng@fenguangmedia.com. And without keeping you waiting any longer, let's get into the content of today's video. The first story of Wang Quan took place in 2011 or 2012. At that time, Quan was only a second or third year student at university. During this period, he had saved up some money, along with borrowing a little from his family. So, he invited a friend named Min, who was studying at the Pedagogical University, to collaborate and open a coffee shop in a vintage style. After Quan and Min discussed and planned everything clearly, they began searching for a rental space. They looked for a location in the area that used to be Tan Hoa Canal in District 6, right on Low Gum Street now, which was once called Tan Hoa Canal. The two found a house located in an alley, a one-story house with 2 upper floors in an old style, situated right at the intersection of the street. At that time, they ran over and saw a sign on the house that said for rent. Quan described the surroundings of this place, as the streets on both sides are filled with greenery, and the breeze blowing from Tan Hoa Canal makes it very cool. So seeing that, the two immediately ran in to call the owner to inquire about renting it. After several thorough reviews and inspections of the house, just before the day of the deposit that afternoon, as if sensing something, these 2 individuals decided to return to the house for one last check. For some reason, as soon as they opened the door, the homeowner was standing below while the 2 of them went straight up to the 2nd floor. They said they were going to inspect, but it was not clear what exactly they were checking up there. According to Quan's account, during previous visits, the 2nd floor had a fairly large bedroom, about 20 to 25 square meters, and a locked storage room. The homeowner had mentioned that the small room was a storage area. However, during that final inspection, the homeowner received an unexpected phone call and had to leave urgently. He told Quan and Min, "You two just check around, okay? I left the key for you. Feel free to check. Then I'll be back shortly." When they saw the homeowner leave, the 2 of them quickly went back up to the 2nd floor for another inspection. At that moment, they discovered that the storage room door had been opened at some point, even though just a few days prior, it had been locked very securely. And due to Wang Quan's great curiosity, he did not hesitate to step in to take a look. As soon as he opened the door, he was startled because inside that room was not a storage room, but a worship room. The room was only about 5-6 square meters, and inside there was an altar made of concrete. On the altar, there was a pair of candles, but they had already burned out. On seeing that scene, he pondered for a moment. Just as he was about to leave the room, suddenly his foot stumbled over something right behind the door. It made a thud sound, and when he looked down, he saw it was a picture frame. When he looked closely, the frame depicted a man drawn in charcoal. It was unclear whether this man was old or young, but he looked very eerie. What was frightening was that the eyes of the person in the painting were just two round holes, and it was unclear who the artist was. But they had not drawn the pupils for the painting. Behind the picture frame, there were mottled red stains resembling dried blood. Needless to say, at that moment, Wang Quan's mind was racing. Quan immediately called his friend over to show him this storage room. His friend Min, who was somewhat of a skeptic and didn't believe in supernatural matters, was generally unafraid of anything. At that moment, Min was indifferent, as if nothing had happened. He even said, "This is just a lifeless picture. There's nothing to be scared of." Then, without hesitation, he grabbed the frame and threw it out the window before walking straight down the stairs. When they got downstairs and waited for the landlord to return to hand over the keys, Wang Quan began to notice something. Why was Min, who had been so lively and chatty just a moment ago, now unusually quiet? He couldn't understand what was going on with his friend. On the way home, Wang Quan asked, but Min didn't say a word. It wasn't until they stopped at a cafe that Wang Quan noticed Min's face was pale and he was sweating profusely. There was definitely something wrong, so Wang Quan pressed him repeatedly. "Why is your face so pale all of a sudden? What happened? Tell me." Finally, Min honestly recounted when it threw away that frame and stepped down, leaving that room. Suddenly, as if someone called it, Min turned back. When looking, Min clearly saw there was a huge head, round and plump like a plate, sticking out from the shrine room. The eyes of that head were blood red, glaring fiercely at Min. Not only that, its arm, a long and grotesque one, pointed straight at Min's face, as if it aimed to target it. Min was really scared, completely at a loss for words. That was exactly why Min had been silent the entire way from the storage room until they reached the cafe. When the two of them talked to each other, they both knew that house had something ominous about it. Therefore, they decided to call the owner and said, "I'm sorry, uncle, but after looking closely for the last time, I felt something was off, so I think we won't rent it anymore." And it was very strange that the owner seemed to know something, because normally, if he received such news, he would immediately ask for the reason, like, why. It seemed fine the last few times, but this time, he didn't ask anything, just, for a few moments before hanging up. It was as if he already knew there was something unusual in his house. Although they couldn't rent that ideal house, Quan and Min's plan to open a cafe was still on. So, in the following days, the two continued looking for houses. At this stage, a friend of mine introduced them to a house with one ground floor and one upper floor, complete with a balcony on the top. This house was also located right on Lo Gom Street, just a few dozen meters away from the previous house, the one with the ghost and the round face. And when introduced like that, Quan and Min ran past to take a look. At first glance, this house was built in an older style compared to the previous one. Overall, it was old, but it gave off a nostalgic feeling, very retro. The house had a red-tiled roof, a spacious front yard, and a large tamarind tree providing ample shade. Everything was very suitable for the concept that the two wanted to build for their cafe. There was an interesting coincidence. When they ran past to take a look, they saw two people parked in front of this house. So, both of them stopped to ask about it, and by chance, they discovered that those two people were the homeowners. After chatting for a while, they were invited inside to take a quick look at the house and quickly expressed their desire to rent it. The strange thing was that the landlord immediately agreed without asking what they intended to do with the rental, and he even had a contract ready in the trunk of his car. Seeing that the situation seemed odd, Quan questioned, Sir, could you take your time? Don't you want to ask us what we intend to rent it for?" The landlord heard this, laughed, and replied, "What's there to ask? Looking at the two of you, you seem decent enough. Surely you wouldn't do anything wrong, right? Just go ahead and rent this house." When Mine heard the landlord say that, he immediately agreed and paid a 2-month rent deposit up front. Wang Quan, on the other hand, had a different feeling. He recounted that, at first, when he stepped inside, he felt that the house was so gloomy and strange, even stranger than the previous house. He had planned not to rent this house, but after discussing it with Min, he said, "Hey Min, why are you so quick? I feel like this house is not right, man." But Mine replied, "Oh, come on. The landlord is so enthusiastic. I think this house is fine. It's nothing like what you're worried about." For some reason, hearing Mine say that, Wang Quan was swayed and decided to follow Mine's word. In the end, the two signed the contract, paid the deposit, and then began to renovate the house, hiring workers to make some adjustments, while Quan and Min went to buy antique furniture for decoration, like cabinets, chairs, vases, amplifiers, cassette players, and TVs, from the 1950s to the 1990s. They also bought many other items. Throughout this process, everyone was very busy. A month later, when the cafe opened, many people came to support, but mostly friends and neighbors. At first, everything went very smoothly. Money was flowing, and customers were coming in regularly and in large numbers. Seeing this, Quan and Mine decided to hire 2 more employees, 2 first-year female students from the same economics school as Wang Quan. One was named Yu, and the other was named Yin. Yin was quite sensitive to spiritual matters, just like Wang Quan. On her very first day at the cafe to take a look around, she immediately said, "Hey Quan, I don't know why, but I feel something strange about this house. I'm being honest with you, I'm really scared of ghosts." When hearing the little girl Yin speak so directly, Quan also understood Yin's feelings but still tried to reassure her. "This house has very good feng shui. Don't worry, everything will be fine." The reason Quan said this was because earlier, during the preparations for the grand opening, he had discovered 4 talismans of different colors, green, red, purple, and yellow on the balcony of the upper floor, near the altar. This made Quan very worried. After that, he called Mine to come and take a look, and they decided to invite a feng shui master. This feng shui master was Chinese and lived in District 5. Quan prioritized inviting him because he himself was also of Chinese descent. When the feng shui master arrived, he examined the place carefully and said that this house was very good. The land here was very suitable for feng shui, and there were no issues at all. He even gave Quan and Min some talismans for protection. After receiving confirmation from the feng shui master, Quan felt somewhat relieved and recounted this story to Yu and Yin. After hearing Quan, both girls also felt reassured and agreed to work as servers at the restaurant. However, after a period of successful business, one day, Yui's family had an unexpected matter to attend to back in their hometown. They accidentally took the house key with them, so you couldn't get into her house, and called Quan to ask, "Brother Quan, my house is like this right now. Can I stay over for a day or 2? Of course, Quan didn't make things difficult and immediately agreed, giving Yu the key. That night, after taking a shower, brushing her teeth, and getting ready to go to bed, Yu was dozing off when suddenly she heard a gentle knocking at the door. Knock, Knock. 3 very soft sounds. But for some reason, Yu woke up immediately. The feeling she had at that moment was extremely frightening. Before she could gather her thoughts, Yu heard footsteps tap, 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 echoing in the hallway as if someone was walking by. At first, Yu thought there was a thief, but then she remembered that before going to bed, she had checked and locked the door very carefully, gripping the lock tightly. No one could have entered the house. So who were the knocks at the door and the footsteps she had just heard? Yu began to worry and imagined that she might be facing something unsettling and frightening. So she tried to sit still in her room, pretending not to know anything. But the footsteps in the hallway continued to echo, going back and forth, and the knocking at the door showed no signs of stopping. After a while, instead of gentle knocks, it turned into loud, frantic banging on the door, causing Yu inside to be terrified to the core. The girl sobbed in panic. In that situation, Yu took out her phone to call Quan, then called her friends, reaching out to everyone she could think of. But on the other end, the phone reported no signal. It wasn't that the line was busy, but rather there was completely no reception. She couldn't get in touch with anyone. This only heightened Yu's fear. The girl had no choice but to endure, huddling in her room until dawn. When the sun rose, Quan went to the cafe to prepare food, drinks, and arrange the tables and chairs. At that moment, Quan saw little Yu running down from the bedroom on the first floor, crying uncontrollably and saying, "Brother Quan, I think I can't work here anymore, Brother Quan." Hearing that, Quan was very surprised and asked back, "Oh, what happened, little one?" After a while of comforting and soothing Yu to calm down, knowing this, seeing Yu so panicked, Quan reluctantly agreed to let her take a break from work. That day, Quan and Min had to take over Yu's duties, working very hard due to the lack of staff. However, in Quan's mind, he couldn't stop thinking about the supernatural story that Yu had shared. A few days later, due to the busy work routine, Quan temporarily forgot about that incident. However, another event occurred. Little Yin asked for permission for her boyfriend, who also studied at the economics school with Quan and Yin, to work at the cafe to make it more fun. Since Quan was very easygoing, he agreed right away. This time, it was Yin's boyfriend, named Sean, who encountered something strange. Sean had been working at the cafe for a while, until one day, he came back late from a birthday party or some gathering with friends, and he was a bit tipsy. The place where Sean had been drinking was close to the cafe, so that night, he called Quan and said, "Hey, can I sleep at the cafe tonight? I'm a bit drunk, and I'm right near the cafe anyway." Quan agreed, but said, "Right now, go to Mine's house. It's closer to that place. I have the keys, but my house is further away. Go get the keys at Min's house, okay?" Hearing that, Sean ran over to Min's house to get the keys, then returned to the cafe. He cleaned up a bit and then went upstairs to sleep. With the alcohol in his system, he fell asleep easily. But right at midnight, just like the situation that little Yu had encountered. However, after a while, the knocking stopped. Hearing the knock on the door, Sean immediately woke up, as if he had heard a spirit knocking, no matter how drunk he was. When he woke up, Sean thought for a moment, wondering how strange who was knocking at the door. But feeling a bit dazed, he shrugged it off and let it go. But not even a minute later, Sean heard the sound of a lighter flicking, the click-click like someone striking a flint. At that moment, not knowing what to think, Sean got out of bed and stepped out of his bedroom. He walked to the staircase, bent down to look through the gaps of the steps, and from the first floor, Sean clearly saw, right at the reception desk, where people usually sat, he saw with his own eyes a dark figure, indistinct, with very long hair, holding a lighter, flicking it continuously, but the flame wouldn't ignite. Sean stared at that person for a moment, thinking that it was a thief sneaking into the inn, so he immediately called Quan and Min. But the line on the other end reported that it was unreachable, just like the situation with little Yu earlier. Standing there, hesitating for a moment, Sean decided to slowly go downstairs to check if it was indeed a thief or if he was just imagining things. When Sean stepped down to the ground floor, next to the wall near the reception desk, he reached out to turn on the light. To his surprise, as soon as the light turned on, that long-haired person had completely vanished, leaving no trace behind. At this moment, Sean began to feel a chill run down his spine. Sean was absolutely certain that he had encountered something unusual. Overwhelmed by fear, he immediately turned back to the upper floor. As he reached the corner, you can imagine that the staircase has a landing in the middle, then continues up to the first floor, after which he had to turn left to enter the bedroom. Just as he stepped up to the first floor and had just turned left, oh my God! Sean was utterly terrified when he saw the person he had just seen sitting at the reception desk now appearing, standing right in front of him. According to Sean's description, you guys, that dark shadow had very long hair, red eyes, and it also had 2 fangs. They were very long, curling down to its chin. Its arms reached straight out, as if it wanted to grab Sean's neck, but fortunately, Sean managed to dodge in time. At that moment, since Sean was standing right at the edge of the staircase, he slipped and fell from the first floor, tumbling straight down to the ground floor. Needless to say, with such a strong impact, Sean must have lost consciousness. The next morning, Quan and Min went over and knocked on the door repeatedly, but didn't see Sean come out, even though normally his job required him to wake up very early. Quan was very worried, fearing that something had happened inside, so he quickly ran to get the spare key. When they opened the door and went inside, they discovered Sean lying unconscious at the bottom of the stairs. It goes without saying, both Quan and Min were startled and immediately took Sean to the nearby clinic for treatment. And when Sean woke up, he recounted everything that had happened and was very frightened. Looking at Sean's face at that moment, Quan and Min were sure that he was not lying. Even after waking up from a night of unconsciousness, Sean's face was still pale. Every time he mentioned the image he encountered at the stairs, Sean would still tremble in fear. At that moment, Sean was extremely frightened, terrified to the point where it was unbearable. And of course, when Sean asked to quit her job at the coffee shop, Yin, hearing her boyfriend's story, also dared not work at the coffee shop anymore. Because Yin was scared too. So she quit as well. And with this couple quitting their jobs, there was no one left to work at the coffee shop. Therefore, Min and Quan had to shoulder the burden of running the shop while waiting to hire new staff. While waiting for people to apply for jobs, Quan remembered the 13th or 15th of July. At that time, Quan and Min were on summer break, so they had plenty of time to work. On that day, Quan's family was invited back to their hometown for a death anniversary, so only Quan was at home. And at that time, the coffee shop had no staff, so Quan was extremely afraid that a thief might sneak in and steal things. So he decided to run over to the shop to sleep there that night and lock the door tightly at his family's current home. And the reason why Quan went over like that was because during the time Quan worked at the coffee shop, it followed a retro style with decor items from the 1990s. which were very rare, you know. Many customers who came to drink asked Quan if they could buy some of those decor items, but Quan firmly refused to sell. So he was afraid that the items might get stolen. Moreover, Quan knew about the supernatural stories that you and Sean had told. But since it was a shared business and also his brainchild, Quan had no other choice but to go over to the coffee shop to sleep there. And on that night, truly, even to this day, when Quan tells me about it, he still insists that the image is something he can never forget. It haunts him immensely, you know, because Quan is a young man. Even though it was late, he didn't go to bed early. Quan opened all the doors and sat inside, scrolling on his phone. Around midnight, he quickly tidied up the tables and chairs, closed the doors, and went upstairs to sleep. In that same room where little Yu and Sean used to sleep. Quan said that at midnight, he clearly heard footsteps from a distance approaching his room door. When the footsteps reached the door, they suddenly stopped. Needless to say, at that moment, Quan began to feel anxious. And in the very next second, when the footsteps stopped, a knocking sound echoed. Knock, knock, knock. At first, it was very light, but as time went on, the knocking grew more intense, and Quan understood that it was the spirit in the house doing it. So, he stayed put in his room and didn't open the door. After a while, Quan no longer heard the knocking or banging on the door, but instead there was a sound that resembled bang. Bang, bang, bang of furniture falling or something like that. So, Quan was very scared, to be honest. In the middle of the night, facing such a situation was truly terrifying, my friends. When Quan just took out the cassette player, he turned on the Nailaka Hadara mantra to drive away the ghostly shadow outside the door. But at this moment, from the time Quan turned on the Nailaka Hadara mantra, according to the mindset of Asian people, as long as you play the Nilaka Hadara mantra, the ghosts and spirits will be scared and will leave or will disappear. But no, in this case, right when Quan turned on the Nailaka Hadara mantra, the sound of the mantra was the voice of a monk, resonating the Nailaka Hadara mantra monotonously, sounding very normal. But suddenly that solemn voice gradually transformed into the tone of a woman. It sounded distorted, you know. Just imagine, the monk was reciting the scripture, and now it shifted to the voice of a woman in a twisted manner, like the kind of sound you often hear in horror movies. It was choppy, crackling, and terrifying. And Quan's mindset at that moment, he recounted. Now I have opened the Buddhist scripture, but that ghostly shadow is even distorting the Buddhist scripture. So how powerful could this ghost be? And Quan's mind was not stable anymore. He immediately called his mother for help. On the other end, it was still the subscriber you have dialed is currently unavailable. Just like Sean and you encountered, you know. And after a while, Quan heard the chanting from the cassette player. Then it suddenly stopped. After considering for a moment, Quan decided, I can't stay here. If I do, I'm definitely going to die. Quan decided to leave this bedroom. Scrambling, he opened the door and ran quickly down the stairs. When he reached the front door, Quan intended to take out the key to unlock it. But at that moment, he suddenly remembered that he had left the key in the bedroom upstairs. At the same time, the voice of the Nailaka Hadara, I chant from the cassette player in the bedroom, echoed again in a distorted, booming tone, which frightened Quan so much that he started to cry. Quan is a boy, you know, but in that situation, he was terrified. He was so scared that he cried. He cried out for help, screaming loudly. All he could do was keep his head down, not daring to look back. Because in such circumstances, people tend to imagine many terrifying things, you know. So Quan didn't dare to look towards the stairs. The chanting continued to echo down from the bedroom. He just kept his face pressed against the front door. Pounding. He kept banging. Help me. Someone, please help me. Help me. Help me. With the hope that someone would hear him, that the neighbors would hear and come over to break down the door to save Quan. However, my friends, mixed in with that terrifying sound, Quan could also hear footsteps. The sound of footsteps coming down from the upstairs. Thud. 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 It was already so scary. But due to instinct or curiosity, or perhaps because that dark shadow compelled Quan to turn his head and look at it. And when he turned his head towards the stairs, Quan saw nothing at all. The house was pitch dark, with no lights on. So immediately, Quan took his phone and turned on the flashlight to shine it around. He scanned from left to right, and oh my God. When Quan shone the light to where the cassette player was supposed to be, it wasn't the cassette player upstairs, but an old cassette player right at the reception desk, and there appeared a head, the head of a woman. Quan could only see the head. That head was covered in blood, flowing down, running down from the top of the head. And what was even more terrifying was that it had 4 fangs protruding from the chin, long and sharp, hanging down. At this moment, there's no need to say more. Quan was scared out of his wits. He started crying, kneeling down. Quan prayed. He bowed to that ghost. "Oh, ancestors, please spare me. I promise I will offer a grand ceremony. I promise I will make a big offering. Please spare me." While kneeling, bowing, and crying, you can imagine the scene at that moment. It was so terrifying that this Quan had to kneel and worship that demon. Quan truly didn't know what else to do, except to bury his head in the ground and kneel before that demon. But when Quan heard everything go silent, there were no more sounds. The entire space around Quan was quiet. He thought that the ghost had left. But no. When Quan looked up, he still saw the head of that long-haired female ghost. It was still right there by the cassette player, and was still looking at Quan, and it gave a terrifying smile. According to Quan's account, at that moment, it was just missing the fact that Quan wanted to have a heart attack. He could have died right there. Quan thought to himself, what if I die right here? Then maybe it will let me go. Because the situation was just so horrifying. But in that moment of despair, Quan still tried. He struggled to crawl to the door. He banged on it, screamed. He called for help. And luckily, outside there were a few militia members on night patrol. Hearing the commotion, they broke down the door and rushed in. So Quan managed to escape outside, and one of the militia members asked him, "What are you doing at night making such a racket? Were you being robbed or what?" At that moment, Quan was extremely scared. He no longer had the strength to speak, and after a while, he finally said, "Hey, can I go back to where you guys are sleeping for a bit?" At that time, the militia guys thought to themselves, "Oh my God, the face of this kid. Why is it so pale? And his tears and snot are streaming down. There must be something going on." So, the militia guys let Quan go back to where they were sleeping for the night. And the next morning, when he woke up, he didn't say a single word. The first thing he did was run over to Mine's house and tell Mine about the horrifying story he encountered the night before. But the expression and demeanor of Mine showed that he didn't believe him at all. In fact, Mine even said, "If you don't want to work with me anymore, just say it straight out. Just say it outright. Don't make up stories to scare me. In that moment, Quan was very scared because after spending a night like that, he felt like he just wanted to die right there to escape the fear. As he recounted the story, his face was still a mess, and mine didn't believe him. Instead, he criticized and scolded Quan, leaving Quan at a loss for words. But Quan was determined not to stay in that house. He resolutely decided to leave, forfeiting the 2 months' deposit, taking only the items he had bought himself. And sadly, after that incident, the two of them ended up avoiding each other, just like kids do back in the day. Before leaving, knowing that his friend didn't believe him, Quan turned back and said, "If you say you don't believe me, I dare you to stay in that house for 1 night. Then you'll know if I'm telling the truth or not." And after Quan moved out, and they no longer worked together, there was a period when the two of them didn't see each other anymore. Later, on one occasion when they talked, Quan remembered the incident from the past and asked, "Have you ever gone into that house where you stayed?" Wine replied, "No, I haven't gone in." Then Quan asked, "Oh, why didn't you go in?" Mine simply answered, "I just don't like trying it out, that's all." Nothing more. When Quan heard that response, he didn't know whether his friend had actually gone into that house to try living there or not. However, Mine also just did some business for a while before eventually quitting as well. And by now, that house has been cleared by Quan to be filled in as a road. Quan has a reminder that if anyone has ever lived in the LGM area back in the day, or has ever visited the cafe called Nostalgia, that was indeed Quan's cafe with a friend named Mine. And here we conclude the first major story. Now, let's move on to the second major story, which took place nearly 10 years ago, involving my family's plastic bucket and basin manufacturing facility in Tan Phu. At that time, Quan's brother had rented a workshop next to the house and was recruiting workers. In the beginning, only a few siblings from the family worked together. But after about 2 weeks, 5 people applied for jobs, including a couple, the husband named Yai and the wife named Zhuang. With more employees, Quan's brother managed this production workshop and received numerous orders from various provinces in the Mekong Delta, with the most coming from Ben Tri, Asadek, and Sok Trang. My family was very caring towards the employees, always treating each other like family. Whenever we cooked or had something delicious, we would share it with each other, especially with Mr. Yi and his wife. Quan's mother was particularly concerned about this couple, and the couple, Yai, had 2 children together, one attending kindergarten, while the other was too young, so they had to send the younger one to the grandmother for care, as both parents were working to earn money. In the morning, the couple would usually ride together to work, and in the evening, they would pick up their child from their rented room. They rented a room in the Tu Hu Alley. Overall, life was basically fine. The year this incident happened, Zhuang was around 40 years old and loved her husband and children very much. At work, she was very cheerful and lively with everyone. However, about 3 months after the couple started working, suddenly, Zhuang was no longer cheerful like before. At the workshop, her face was always solemn and sad, as if she was harboring some unspoken sorrow. She did not open up, did not talk, and hardly said anything at all from the moment she arrived at work until she left in the evening. And then everything just went by like that. Quan remembers that day when everyone was working normally in the workshop, and then the couple Yai started arguing with each other. At first, they only exchanged quiet words, but then the argument grew louder and louder. Quan's mother saw the situation and stepped out to intervene, calling Zhuang inside to ask about it. As soon as Kwan's mother asked, it seemed that all the pent-up frustrations that Swang had been holding back for so long burst out. She cried and recounted her story with great sorrow. She said, "I'm so miserable, sister. My husband has never acted like this before. Suddenly, now he has gone astray, getting familiar with another girl." She also mentioned that 2 months ago, when her husband asked for permission to come home early, Zhuang thought he was going out to have fun or had some urgent matter to attend to. But unexpectedly, that afternoon, when she went to pick up their child, she saw him driving with a strange girl sitting behind. When they got home, she asked him, and he confessed that he was having an affair. Since then, they have often fought with each other. Swang choked back tears. "Now I'm so miserable, sister." When Kwan's mother finished listening to the story, she comforted and consoled Sister Zhuang a lot. However, Kwan's mother could only stop at providing comfort, as it was not her place to interfere in someone else's family matters. Her role was simply to offer consolation, while the deeper issues between the couple could only be resolved by them. However, after that day, Sister Zhuang and her husband no longer went to work together. Sometimes she arrived first, sometimes he did, and they no longer appeared together as they used to. Gradually, perhaps due to the immense pressure Sister Zhuang endured, she fell into a state of depression. And then, a few months later, Kwan clearly remembered one afternoon, while watering the plants outside, he saw Sister Zhuang whispering with a young man named Zen. They had been very close before. A little later, Sister Zhuang came out and said to Kwan, "Hey, later, when your mother comes back, please tell her that I went out with Zin for a bit, and I'll ask to go home early. Remember to tell your mother that, okay?" When Kwan heard it, he nodded, and then the two sisters, Swang and Zin, took the bike and drove away. A few days later, Kwan learned that Sister Zhuang had asked Zin to take her to the house of the girl with whom her husband was having an affair to confront her. Hearing it directly from Zin later, when he took Sister Swang to the girl's dormitory, both sides got into a heated argument and fought loudly. Many people in the dormitory block heard the commotion and rushed out to intervene. After a while of chaos, Zin finally took Sister Zhuang back home. That night, it was unclear what the girl had said to Sister Zhuang's husband, but at midnight, he sneaked back to the dormitory, shouting and violently beating Sister Zhuang. Not only that, he was so cruel that he threw all the belongings of the three of them out onto the street, locked the door, and kicked them out. The people in the dormitory heard the situation and gathered to advise him, but at this point, the husband was too intoxicated and no longer listened to anyone's advice. He resolutely refused to let the three of them back into the house. In deep despair, Sister Zhuang had no choice but to take her two children to temporarily rent a hotel near the dormitory to stay overnight. The next morning, she returned home. However, from then on, although Yi and Zhuang continued to work for Kwan's family, they did not look at each other at all. During lunch, each person sat in a corner, quietly eating without saying a word to one another. This situation continued for several days thereafter. Then one evening, after everyone had returned home from work, Kwan's mother was cleaning the house, preparing dinner, and then went up to her room to rest. However, there was something very strange, as if there was some kind of intuition. Kwan's mother lay there unable to sleep, her eyes heavy, unable to open them. But no matter how hard she tried, she could not doze off. In her heart, Kwan's mother felt as if there was a fire burning, restless and uneasy, as if she was sitting on a pile of coals. A sense of panic and discomfort continuously rose within her, preventing her from relaxing or falling asleep. And a little while later, Kwan's mother decided to take a walk around the house to relax. Finally, she went up to the rooftop, sat there, and began to read Buddhist scriptures to calm her mind. After finishing her reading, as she was preparing to return to her room to rest, she noticed her phone vibrating next to the cushion. On the screen appeared Zhuang's number. Immediately, Kwan's mother answered the call. On the other end of the line, Zhuang was crying uncontrollably, choking on her words as she said, "Sister, I'm suffering so much right now. My husband has changed his personality. He hits me, and he wants a divorce to marry that witch. I don't want to live anymore, sister." Hearing this, Kwan's mother became very worried. She knew that someone in a state of distress and depression like Zhuang was very likely to have suicidal thoughts. Therefore, she tried to comfort her, saying, "Come on, try to live for the sake of the children. Don't pay attention to this and that. And don't let that despicable husband bother you anymore." But Zhuang paid no attention to her advice, becoming increasingly agitated as they spoke. She continuously mentioned wanting to die to be free, and even demanded to turn into a ghost to come back and haunt the two of them. And just when Kwan's mother decided to speak up and offer advice, once again, unexpectedly, Sister Zhuang hung up the phone. And because she feared that Sister Zhuang might be thinking irrationally and would do something foolish, Kwan's mother immediately called Sister Zhuang back, and on the other end, someone picked up. But there was no voice responding, only the sound of howling wind. After hearing this, oh my God, I don't know how to describe it. When Kwan's mother recounted it to Kwan, she said the feeling at that moment was truly eerie, hair-raising, so frightening that she didn't know what to do. She tried to call back again, but still only heard the sound of the line being picked up without anyone answering. She thought perhaps Sister Zhuang had picked up, but didn't want to talk anymore. Waiting until the next morning, when Kwan's mother was sitting in the room and had just dozed off a little, Kwan's older brother rushed over to knock on the door, breathless to report the news. Mom, Sister Zhuang, yes, wife, hanged herself last night." At this moment, Kwan's mother was in a panic, even though she had been restless all night. She asked her son, "How did you know about this?" Kwan's older brother replied, "Around 4 a.m. Yai called. And he said that he had a fight with Zhuang yesterday, and then Yai left. When he came home at midnight, he opened the door and found his wife hanging. Zhuang's body was already cold." At this point, Kwan's mother was horrified. Kwan's brother went on to say that when Zhuang hung herself, her two children were still sleeping in the room, completely unaware of what was happening. When Yai came home and saw his wife dead, he panicked and cried out. After a while, Zhuang's mother and many neighbors gathered around. The police also arrived at the scene to investigate and examine the body. The final conclusion from the investigation agency was that Zhuang had committed suicide, and it was not a murder staged to look like one. Zhuang's mother was very angry because she understood why her daughter chose to take her own life. She was furious with her worthless son-in-law, as it was because of him that her daughter had to die. But now that Zhuang was gone, nothing could be changed anymore, so she could only swallow her resentment and quietly lead her two grandchildren home. In the days that followed, this Yai guy asked Kwan's brother for temporary leave from work to take care of Zhuang's funeral. And after Zhuang passed away, he continued to live in that rented room, but the two children were sent back to Zhuang's mother to be raised. Since the two children were no longer in the rented house, almost every night, Zhuang appeared in Yu's dreams. She blamed him, saying that he was the reason she had to die, and she even intended to drag him along to pay for her life. The frequency of these haunting dreams continued to occur, causing Yi to live in fear every night. One night, around 2 to 3 a.m., while he was sleeping, he suddenly woke up to strange noises outside. Listening carefully, he heard the sound of dishes clinking, rattling. At first, I thought there was a thief in the house, so he tiptoed to check. When he reached the kitchen, he turned on the light, and the sight before him terrified him, nearly causing him to have a heart attack. He recounted that as soon as the light turned on, he saw the refrigerator door wide open, and a person was rummaging through the food inside. Before he could react, that person slowly turned their head to look at him, and it was none other than Zhuang. But it was her spirit, with a long tongue nearly touching the ground. The spirit of Sister Zhuang continuously licked the food in the refrigerator, causing it to spill everywhere. In that moment of panic, fortunately, this guy, he quickly calmed down and ran outside, screaming loudly throughout the dormitory. The neighbors heard the shouting and rushed over, but when they entered the house to check, of course, there were no signs of anything unusual. No one saw the spirit or any horror stories as I had described. However, all the food in the refrigerator was still scattered on the floor, confirming that something abnormal had occurred. After that night, when Yi witnessed the spirit of his wife in such a terrifying form, he was so frightened that he immediately decided to leave the house and move elsewhere. And this Yi did not dare to stay in that dorm room for even one more day. Sometime after Yi moved out, although he had relocated to another place, he still worked at Quan's family workshop. He shared the story of encountering the spirit of Zhuang with everyone, saying that even though he had changed his residence, her spirit continued to haunt him, persistently trying to drag him to death alongside her. After a while, he requested to quit his job entirely, no longer working at Quan's workshop. Since then, no one knew where he had gone, what he was doing, or if he was still being disturbed by Zhuang's spirit. As for Zhuang's close friend, Xin, who had once driven her to confront Yi's mistress, he continued to work at the workshop after I left. One time, Xin recounted a strange experience to Quan. That day, during lunchtime, Xin was lying asleep on a large chair when he suddenly heard someone calling his name. At that moment, Xin was very tired after a whole morning of work, so he slowly opened his eyes, sat up, and looked outside the workshop. He saw a woman dressed entirely in black, from head to toe, with long hair cascading down. When he looked more closely, the strange thing was that he could not see the woman's face clearly. But what terrified Xin the most was the woman's tongue, which was red and very long. The woman kept beckoning, calling Xin's name. "Xin, come out and play with me. Xin, it's so much fun out here. Come on, Xin." Hearing this, Xin was scared, trembling like a dried fish. He covered his eyes and mouth with his hands while continuously chanting Buddhist scriptures. By the time the workday ended, Xin asked Quan's brother for a few days off to go back to his hometown because he was too frightened. And Xin knew for sure who that woman was. Occasionally, the workers in the workshop also shared stories about seeing a woman standing by the roadside, constantly beckoning them to come play. However, thanks to the advice from Quan's mother, no one encountered any harm. After the tragic spiritual events related to Sister Zhuang, the family invited a sorcerer to perform rituals and pray for Sister Zhuang's soul to find peace. Since the day of the prayer and the ritual for Sister Zhuang's soul, no one in the workshop had seen her appear again. Perhaps Sister Zhuang's soul had followed the Buddha and found liberation. And here we come to the end of the second great story. Next will be the third great story, which Quan calls the Retribution of Killing the Devil's Goat. This is also a chilling tale related to Quan's family that took place in 1984 in the family of his Aunt Oot named Aunt X Sing. And this story once shocked the entire neighborhood of Aunt Sing. Specifically, the incident occurred in a place that is now located in an alley next to the gas station on Luban Bai Street, Tan Phu District. This year, Aunt Sing is already 62 or 63 years old, but when she recounted this story to Quan's family, Aunt Xing was only about over 50 years old. To help everyone understand better, it is first necessary to say a little about Aunt Xing. Aunt Xing was born in 1960 and got married in 1979. By the year the story takes place, she'd already given birth to 2 daughters. Aunt Xing recounted that her in-laws were very harsh. In particular, her parents-in-law were always looking for trouble, making things difficult for her. Mildly, they would scold her, and severely, they would beat her. Aunt Xing's mother-in-law often beat her mercilessly with a whip. While hitting her, she would shout, "Why can't you give birth to a son? You only give birth to daughters." Not only did she scold Aunt Xing, but she also insulted Aunt Xing's own family. In general, Aunt Xing's mother-in-law was very cruel. Aunt X Xing's husband was no better. He was carefree and indifferent, witnessing his parents beat and scold his wife without daring to defend her even once. All day long, he would just hang out with his friends to drink and party. Aunt Xing shared, "If it weren't for the children and my strong spirit, I would have hanged myself a long time ago. Living with my in-laws, being scolded and beaten every day is an immense humiliation and suffering." Add a bit more about the family of Aunt Xing's husband. Since the time of her husband's great-grandfather, they have been in the goat slaughtering business. When Aunt Xing came to be a daughter-in-law, the family continued this trade. Aunt X Xing recounts that this family is very wealthy, but not in a flashy way, with villas, luxury cars, or extravagant clothing. Instead, their wealth is reflected in cash and gold jewelry. Aunt X Xing's in-laws are Mr. Fu and Mrs. Shen, who are Chinese. They bought a large chest and a big safe, and all the cash and gold jewelry they accumulated are stored in there, not deposited in banks or invested in real estate. All their assets are securely locked away in the safe. Mr. Fu and Mrs. Shen have 2 sons. The elder brother is named Feng, who is married and has 2 sons. The elder son is named Kai, who is 15 years old, and the younger son is named Yan, who is 13 years old. Aunt X Xing's husband is named Fei, born in 1958, 2 years older than Aunt Xing. When she first became a daughter-in-law, everything was relatively normal for Aunt Xing. The day before the family tragedy occurred, Mr. Feng, the eldest son of Mr. Fu and Mrs. Shen, had a memorable event. Aunt X Xing recounted that 1 week prior, on a usual morning, her in-laws dragged a goat to the back of the garden to prepare for slaughter. Before killing the goat, Mr. Fu tied it up and took a stick to hit it. Mr. Fu said that he had to beat the goat to make it sweat. The purpose was to get rid of its foul smell. Mr. Fu beat the goat until it cried out and ran around the yard. Aunt X Xing said that every time she witnessed this scene, she felt like she was witnessing a medieval torture. The goat's desperate cries, along with the sound of the stick striking its body, were deafening and made Aunt Xing shudder. The goat was beaten and chased until it collapsed. That was when the process of cleaning the foul smell ended, meaning the goat had been beaten to death. And after the goat was killed, the next job was to clean the fur, cut the throat, and remove the entrails, similar to how people butcher pigs. This task was handled by Mrs. Shen, Mr. Fu's wife. The family did not hire outside workers. Only the parents-in-law and the eldest brother managed all the steps. On that day, as evening approached, the goat meat was sold out completely. Aunt Xing recounted that there were times when customers came to buy even more, but due to a lack of meat to sell, they had to turn them away. Goat meat was in high demand, quickly selling out every time. After the sales were done, Mrs. Shen would usually sit in the room, keeping the accounts and counting the money, while Mr. Fu went to the cafe at the end of the alley to play Chinese chess. The couple of the eldest brother took their child out to play, while Aunt Xing's husband, as usual, went out drinking. When drunk, he would stagger home to sleep. That evening, Aunt Xing vividly remembered that she was carrying her youngest daughter downstairs to prepare milk. As she passed by the backyard, where everyone usually killed the goats, she caught a glimpse of a goat gliding past the water basin, the basin that the family used to clean the blood and prepare the goat meat. At that moment, Aunt Xing was holding her child in her arms, and as she turned her head, she clearly saw a black goat wandering around the water basin in the backyard. What was strange was that the goat's head did not resemble the usual goat head that Aunt Xing was accustomed to seeing. Its head was round and looked very bizarre. Aunt Xing sensed that something was wrong, so she turned on the outside light to see better. And, oh my goodness, at that moment, Aunt Xing was so startled that she almost dropped the child she was holding. Fortunately, she managed to hold on and did not let the baby fall. As soon as the light came on, the black goat turned its head and looked straight at Aunt Xing. The most horrifying thing was that its head was not a goat's head, but a human head split in half as if it were about to be severed. The sight terrified Aunt Xing to the utmost. At that moment, Aunt Yeags was extremely frightened, so scared that she screamed for her mother-in-law to come down and see. But when her mother-in-law stepped out, she saw no goat as Aunt Xing had described. All the goats were locked up in the pen at that time. Mrs. Shen didn't believe her and thought Aunt Xing was making up stories, so she scolded her harshly, berating her with all sorts of insults. Mrs. Shen was so angry that she used vulgar language to curse Aunt Xing, causing Aunt Xing's youngest daughter to jump and cry even more. However, Aunt Xing insisted that she could not be mistaken. After that incident, Aunt Xing was very scared and didn't dare to go down to the back house alone anymore. Whenever she needed to go down, she had to wait for her husband to come home and plead with him to go with her. But Aunt Xing's husband, as usual, did not believe her and refused to help, even yelling and cursing at Aunt Xing. Nevertheless, Aunt Xing's husband never physically abused her. He only yelled. A few days later, thinking that everything had ended, one day unexpectedly, Feng's wife screamed, causing a commotion throughout the neighborhood. The reason was that she discovered her eldest son, named Kai, sitting in the middle of the backyard, taking the goat's entrails out of the trash bag and eating it with delight. That scene terrified everyone in the house and the entire neighborhood. This kid Kai, he was just eating, munching away as if this was the most delicious food ever. He ate in such a delightful manner that when everyone noticed, his mouth was full of blood. Just imagine a child eating raw food with a mouth full of blood like that. Who wouldn't be terrified? Kai's mother panicked and screamed, causing everyone in the house to rush outside. They tried to bring Kai inside to clean him up thoroughly. When people asked why he was eating raw food like that, Kai didn't answer, just remained silent and stuck out his tongue, licking around his mouth with a look of complete satisfaction. However, his eyes were very vacant, lifeless, lacking the usual alertness. The scene made anyone who witnessed it shudder. At this time, Mr. and Mrs. Fu Shen, who valued sons over daughters, were extremely worried when they noticed their grandson exhibiting strange behavior. They thought that little Kai might be suffering from some illness, so they instructed Mr. and Mrs. Feng to take the boy to the hospital for an examination. Upon receiving the test results, the doctor concluded that Kai was suffering from a nervous shock. Mr. and Mrs. Feng were shocked to hear this, as their son had always been normal at school, lively and sharp, and had never experienced any accidents or issues related to his nerve. Unwilling to accept this diagnosis, they decided to take Kai to a larger hospital for a second opinion, but the results were no different. It was still concluded that Kai was suffering from a nervous shock. This news hit them like a bolt from the blue. Kai's mother was heartbroken, crying uncontrollably. But ultimately, they had to take Kai home to care for him. After the incident where the boy ate goat intestines, his mother became even more protective, always keeping a close eye on him and following him around no matter what she was doing. One day, Aunt Xing spoke with Kai and asked, "How are you doing lately? Why did you act that way last time?" To which Kai replied in a strange manner, "I am a goat. Your husband's family killed my family. Now, I am looking for a way to kill your husband's family." The boy's response sent shivers down Aunt Xing's spine, leaving her at a loss for how to handle this bizarre situation. Oh my God, can you imagine? When a 15-year-old nephew of Aunt Xing suddenly utters such words, claiming to be a goat. It's needless to say, Aunt Xing felt a chill run down her spine, her skin prickling all over. She was very scared, but Aunt Xing knew for sure that if she told this story, no one would believe her. In fact, they might think she was crazy, slandering, or was deliberately pretending to be a ghost. Therefore, despite her deep concern, Aunt Xing decided not to get close to that boy Kai anymore. But she also didn't share this story with anyone. However, what was unexpected was that the boy Kai's words turned out to be true. On that fateful night, the whole neighborhood lost power, as if it were a foreboding sign. Aunt Xing recounted that on that day, around 7 to 8 p.m., Mr. and Mrs. Fu Shen, Aunt Xing's husband, and Brother Feng were sitting in the living room chatting. Aunt Xing was washing the dishes in the back kitchen, and her two daughters were already asleep. While she was busy arranging the dishes, Aunt Xing suddenly heard a male voice coming from outside, specifically near the banana bushes close to the wall of the house, about 10 steps away from where Aunt Xing was. The voice whispered, "Hey you thread this string into your neck. Then we'll go play some more. You thread this string into your neck, you." Those words left Aunt Xing stunned, not knowing what was about to happen. Aunt Xing was puzzled when she heard a strange male voice say, "You thread the rope around your neck," because in the house, all the men were sitting in the living room. At that moment, Aunt Xing felt that something was strange and eerie. Out of curiosity, she moved closer to the wall to see what was happening. Oh my God! And right at that moment, Aunt Xing was horrified. Aunt Yi saw Kai with a rope threaded around his younger brother Yin's neck. It was as if he knew Aunt Xing was watching him. But what was even more terrifying was that his expression was not one of panic or fear. On the contrary, he grinned at Aunt Xing, a cold and sinister smile. This scene terrified Aunt Xing to the core, leaving her unsure of what to do in the face of Kai's horrifying actions. Right after that, Kai turned back to look at his younger brother, Yain, and in his hand, he held a very large piece of wood. Quick as lightning, he raised the piece of wood high and began to strike Yain's head repeatedly, laughing maniacally as he did so. Witnessing such a brutal and horrifying scene, Aunt Xing was struck dumb with fear. She shouted,
"Oh my God, Kai is killing Yain!"
"Mom, Dad, hurry out here." The frantic cries of Aunt Xing, along with Yain's painful screams, stirred the entire neighborhood. When everyone ran out and shone their lights, they saw that Yain had been beaten to death by his brother. Yain's head was crushed like a watermelon. The scene was just like how Mr. Fu usually killed the goat every day. At that moment, the mother of Kaye and Yain, along with Mrs. Shen, the mother-in-law of Aunt Xing, fainted immediately after witnessing the horrifying scene. The others in the village were also in a panic, screaming loudly. The scene was truly chaotic. Kaye was apprehended by several men in the village, but his face remained calm, showing no emotion at all. Mr. Fu, with his naturally gruff demeanor, was extremely angry and rushed over to slap Kai repeatedly, shouting, "You bastard! Why did you kill your brother? Have you gone mad?" People immediately cried out and called the police. Soon after, the authorities arrived to investigate the scene, and Kay was taken to the station for questioning. During the time Kay was detained, the family held back their grief to organize a funeral for Yain. Quan's mother also attended the funeral. The night before, the coffin was to be carried for burial. Aunt Ing had a dream. In her dream, she found herself standing in the backyard where she had previously seen a goat with a human head. She clearly remembered that in the dream, she was fumbling around as if searching for something. Suddenly, a man's voice echoed in her ear, a chilling voice that seemed to resonate from the depths of hell. The voice was clear, slow, and distinct, rising and falling. "We're right behind you. What are you looking at?" That statement left Aunt Xing in the dream utterly terrified. As soon as she finished speaking, Aunt Xing heard the sound of goats bleating all around, and it was quite terrifying. The bleating of the goats sounded as if they were being brutally beaten. The painful sounds grew louder, causing Aunt Xing to shudder. Just when Aunt Xing, in panic, looked back, she saw at the wooden post, where her in-laws usually tied the goat to beat it, the ground was littered with the mangled corpses of the slaughtered goats. They were writhing in agony, blood flowing abundantly, pooling into a puddle like a stream. Overwhelmed with fear, Aunt Xing immediately screamed and jolted awake from the nightmare. And just as Aunt Xing woke up, her two daughters were startled awake as well. The two daughters of Aunt Xing cried out loudly, causing the whole family to be startled. Everyone hurried into the room to check, and they saw Aunt Xing's mother-in-law and husband standing there as well. Aunt Xing immediately recounted her dream, but no one in the family believed her. The neighbors, upon hearing her story, also did not believe her. They just thought Aunt Xing was under psychological pressure, which was why she dreamed of such nonsense. After that, they all left, leaving Aunt Xing alone in the room to soothe her two children. By midnight, when all the neighbors had gone home, only Aunt Xing's in-laws were left to keep watch over the coffin. At that moment, everyone was sitting outside in the yard when Fei, Aunt Xing's husband, took a chair to lie down behind the coffin because he had drunk too much during the afternoon and was extremely drunk. He was sleeping soundly when suddenly he was startled awake by a calling. The voice clearly rang out, "Uncle Fei. Uncle Fei." At that moment, Mr. Fei opened his eyes to see who was calling him and, oh my God! The scene before him made Mr. Fei panic. He shouted loudly and fell out of the chair, running out in a hurry because right next to him was his nephew named Yine, who had just died and was lying in the coffin. But at that moment, Yine had appeared, standing right next to Mr. Fei with a crushed head, blood everywhere, and he leaned closely into Mr. Fei's face. There's no need to say much. Mr. Fei was so frightened that he ran outside, his face pale and devoid of any color. He was so scared that he even wet his pants. When his family saw him like that, they asked what had happened, but Mr. Fei recounted the incident and no one believed him. Not a single person in the house trusted Mr. Fei. On the contrary, Mr. Fei's brother, who is the father of the deceased Yine, just lost his child. He was furious and scolded Mr. Fei, "Shut your mouth. You've been drinking too much, drinking all the time. Your brain must be completely messed up. The person lying in that coffin is your own nephew. How can there be any ghosts or demons around here?" Outside, the two cousins were still arguing loudly, and Aunt Xing could hear everything clearly from inside the house. After a while, Aunt Xing's husband walked into the room with a sullen face, saying nothing, and climbed onto the bed, lying still. Aunt Xing intended to say something comforting, but when she saw him throw the blanket over his face, she could only sigh. Aunt Xing carried her youngest child over to the other bed to sleep, when suddenly, she felt as if something had just brushed past her window. At that moment, Aunt Xing felt a chill run through her. Although she was very hesitant, after a while, she tried to calm herself, closed the window, and returned to the bed to hold her child and sleep. Not long after, she suddenly heard the faint sound of a goat bleating by her ear. Aunt Xing knew for sure that something was troubling her, but she decided to ignore it and tried to close her eyes to sleep again. However, she couldn't fall asleep no matter what. Aunt Xing kept tossing and turning, and finally had to sit up, clasp her hands, and pray to her ancestors, reciting Buddhist scriptures using every method she knew. While Aunt Xing was praying with her hands clasped, suddenly the window made a loud bang, startling her. When she turned to look, she saw that the window she had just locked securely from the inside was now wide open. And when Aunt Xing ran over to close the window, she glanced outside, right at the spot where the path led to the backyard. There was a goat with a human head, just like the goat Aunt Xing had seen for the first time. At that moment, Aunt Xing was so terrified that her hands and feet trembled uncontrollably. She hurriedly picked up her two daughters and ran outside, recounting this story to her in-laws. Meanwhile, Aunt Xing's husband was still wrapped in a blanket, sleeping in the room, completely unaware of what was happening. Outside, when everyone saw Aunt Xing leading her children out, her youngest daughter was crying loudly, causing discomfort to Mrs. Shen, Aunt Xing's mother-in-law. Mrs. Shen shouted angrily, in the middle of the night, "Why are you bringing them out here, making them cry so loudly? Go back inside. Hurry up." But Aunt Xing was too frightened and refused to go back inside. She told her in-laws that she had just seen a goat with a human head appear in the backyard. At this point, Mr. Fu and Mrs. Shen began to feel uneasy and recalled the strange occurrences that had happened in the house, all of which were related to the goat. They started to feel anxious and worried, and they allowed the three of them, Aunt Xing and her children, to sit outside for a while. Suddenly, everyone heard the frantic scream of Mr. Fei, Aunt Xing's husband, coming from inside the house. This was the second time Mr. Fei had run out in a panic, but this time it was even more terrifying than the last. Mr. Fei was in a state of utter turmoil, completely different from the previous occasion. His brother, Mr. Feng, had to hold him back to calm him down and help Mr. Fei regain his composure. After a while, Mr. Fei began to recount the horrifying story of what had just happened. Mr. Fei said that when he woke up, he vaguely saw someone lying next to him, facing away from him. He thought it was Aunt Xing, so he reached out to embrace that person. Since he was already under the influence of alcohol, he intended to undress to engage in sexual relations. But just as he turned that person around to look directly at their face, Fei was terrified to the core. Because before him was not Aunt Xing, but a goat with a human head. Its body split in two. Even more horrifying, the goat looked at him and gave a ghastly grin. Its head was drenched in blood, and then it spoke. "It's me. It's me, Uncle Fei." The goat had just finished speaking when it let out a cry, a sound exactly like that of a goat being tortured, bleating "Bee, bee, bee." That scream frightened Mr. Fei out of his wits, sobering him up completely, and that was why he panicked and ran outside like that. After hearing Mr. Fei's story, everyone in the family was terrified. They immediately gathered to discuss and decided to invite a shaman to investigate the matter thoroughly, as they were certain that they could not overlook this story. The family believed that there must be something related to the spiritual realm, perhaps a ghost haunting the house. After burying the second son of Mr. Feng, the family invited a Chinese shaman. This shaman was originally from Fujian, but her home was on Ungian Tray Street, District 5, across from the Songqin Assembly Hall. As soon as she stepped into the house, the shaman immediately felt uncomfortable. She grimaced and said to the family, "Oh my goodness, why is there such a strong smell of evil Kai in this house?" The sorceress also added that she could see throughout this house the corpses of the goats that had been tortured and killed by the family for meat. Their bodies lay scattered, blood flowing like a river. Hearing this, Mr. Fu, the father-in-law of Aunt Xing, questioned the sorceress. "Master, when I bought this house to turn it into a goat slaughterhouse, I consulted another sorcerer first. That sorcerer said the feng shui of this land was very good. The old house in Tan Bin was too small, and every time we slaughtered goats, the neighbors complained, so my family bought this larger house, far from the neighbors, to make our work easier." The sorceress nodded in acknowledgement and replied, "The other sorcerer was not wrong. He spoke the truth. But the truth here is that this land is good for building homes and doing business, not for turning it into a slaughterhouse to torture and kill countless lives of those goats." The sorceress also added that, besides having the evil spirit of the goat, there are many lost souls and evil spirits drawn to this house. The reason for this, according to the sorceress, is that although the family has set up an altar for worship, they did not invite items from the temple, but only bought things from outside to offer. Moreover, their worship is done simply, without the proper rituals for invocation, and they do not sincerely pray. The most important reason, the sorceress said, is that the family has slaughtered goats too many times. The blood from the goat slaughter gradually seeps into the ground, making it become tainted land, accumulating a lot of yin Q and evil Q. Because of this, the spirits and ghosts from outside gather here and reside on this piece of land. The sorceress emphasized that no deities or Buddhas would witness a family that continuously engages in killing like this, slaughtering every day, with blood flowing day after day, spanning many generations. This creates negative energy, causing the family to be haunted. There is no need to say much. At this moment, Aunt Xing and her husband's family were very frightened upon hearing the words of the sorceress, to the point that they wanted to kneel down and beg her to help find a way to remove the dark forces weighing heavily on their family. However, the sorceress firmly refused. She said, "I cannot help, because the karma of killing that has accumulated in your family for a long time is difficult to dissolve and almost impossible to remove." The sorceress advised, if possible, your family should quit the goat slaughtering profession, eat vegetarian meals daily, recite Buddhist scriptures, and cultivate good deeds to reduce some of the negative karma. She stated, only when you truly change your way of living and do good deeds can this bad karma possibly be alleviated to some extent. After offering her advice, the sorceress declined to accept any money, even though Mrs. Shen tried to give her more. The sorceress emphasized that she came to help out of connection, not for money, and she resolutely refused to accept any payment. However, although Mr. Fu and Mrs. Shen agreed with the sorceress's advice, it seemed they were not entirely willing. They still regretted the money from this profession. After inviting the sorcerer to check on the situation, the family was very worried, but the slaughtering of goats continued as usual. Aunt Xing was extremely anxious, but the number of people coming to buy goat meat kept increasing. In particular, the son of Uncle Feng, the boy Kai. Although his family had arranged for him to avoid prison, no one expected that 2 or 3 years later, his condition would worsen even further. Kai fell seriously ill, his mind no longer sane. Whenever his parents were not home, he would struggle, break free, and many times chase after his grandparents with a knife. Aunt Xing had to shout for help to stop him. This incident happened many times, causing his grandparents, Grandpa Fu and Grandma Shen, to become extremely frightened. Finally, they could no longer bear it and decided to move back to their old house in Tan Bin, leaving the new house to Aunt Xing's family and Uncle Feng's family. Although Aunt Xing and her family lived in that house, normally, she occasionally dreamed of ghostly spirits and the goat wandering around the house. This terrified Aunt Xing and caused her to fall ill on several occasions. When she could no longer endure it, Aunt Xing decided to send her 2 children to stay with their maternal grandparents, and she often went to the temple to do good deeds and eat vegetarian food every day. Thanks to that, gradually Aunt Xing no longer dreamed of those horrific images. One day, Aunt Xing recounted, when I returned home from the temple, I saw a large crowd gathered outside, all looking inside. Aunt Xing did not understand what was happening, but upon seeing more ambulances arrive, her anxiety grew. She hurried into the house and heard the wife of Uncle Feng wailing mournfully, while Uncle Feng kept fainting repeatedly. Aunt Xing's in-laws, Mr. Fu and Mrs. Shen, sat in stunned silence, unable to utter a word, just sitting quietly in one place. As Aunt Xing rushed to comfort her in-laws, she saw people carrying the body of Kai, covered in blood, placing it in a body bag and zipping it up, preparing to take it to the ambulance. At that moment, Aunt Xing understood what had happened. When she heard people recounting the events, Aunt Xing learned that Kai had used a knife to cut goat meat and had slashed his own throat to commit suicide. By the time his parents discovered it, it was too late and they could not intervene in time. After hearing about Kai's suicide, Aunt Xing was left speechless at that moment. Although in the past, Feng and his wife did not like Aunt Xing and often ignored her when she was scolded by her in-laws, at this moment, Aunt Xing couldn't help but feel pity for the Feng family, who had lost both of their sons at once. After that, Heartbreaking tragedy. Mr. Fu and Mrs. Shen decided to abandon that house entirely, leaving it to the authorities to do as they wished. Uncle Feng's wife, since losing both of her children, had become insane. She wandered the streets all day, and whenever she encountered any child around the age of her own, she would rush over and claim that it was her child, as if she were suffering from severe psychological trauma. Seeing his wife in such a state, Uncle Feng also felt helpless. After a while, he left home without anyone knowing where he had gone. To this day, Aunt Xing has not heard any news about the whereabouts of her former brother-in-law. However, according to what Aunt Xing said, her parents-in-law were still living quite peacefully. Mr. and Mrs. Fu Sheng had changed their profession from butchering goats to lending money at high interest rates. Their life was quite comfortable until both of them grew old and passed away. It is uncertain whether this could be called karma, but perhaps if the debts of this life are not repaid, they will be settled in the next life, or the children and grandchildren will have to bear the consequences. When Mr. and Mrs. Fu Sheng passed away, their funeral was held properly, and they were buried in a normal manner. However, Aunt Xing's husband, Mr. Fei, had been separated from Aunt Xing since she was 30 years old. By the time she was 34, they officially divorced. Since then, Aunt Xing has lived a single life, raising her children on her own. Aunt Xing's 2 daughters later got married and lived a peaceful and happy life. And here we come to the end of the 3rd story, which is also the conclusion of today's video. First of all, Destroyer of Souls would like to express my gratitude to Quan, as all 3 stories today are very eerie, and especially the last story is truly horrifying and brutal, making me feel goosebumps at times while telling it. The story is incredibly terrifying. If everyone enjoyed today's video, don't forget to hit the like button, share it, and most importantly, click on the subscribe button. Please tap the bell icon next to it to receive notifications as soon as I release a new video. At the same time, feel free to leave your opinions in the comments section below to increase interaction with the channel. If any uncles, aunts, brothers, sisters, or friends have any true spiritual stories from themselves, their family, or friends, don't hesitate to email me at njofuang@fenquangmedia.com. Thank you all once again. Goodbye, and see you in the next video.